Okay, we're gonna get started. Hello, everybody. Great to see you. And a huge thank you, Dr. Jones and Elaine, for joining us today. Today is August 27th, 2020, the day after Women's Equality Day. And 100 years ago yesterday, on August 26, 1920, the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution officially took effect when the US Secretary of State signed a proclamation certifying its ratification. And that was a culmination of a generations-long struggle by women that ended in securing them the right to vote, at least on paper. And today, I'm really thrilled to have two of America's foremost authorities on women's suffrage and all its complexities, shortcomings, the highlights, the lowlights with me and with all of you. We are lucky enough to call you both Marylanders as well, which is very cool, and Baltimoreans. So today I'm just going to introduce them both, make a few introductory remarks, and then turn the Zoom platform over to both of them to make some introductory remarks, and then we'll delve into some of the questions that folks have as well. If you're joining us on Zoom, please feel free to write your questions in the chat. We'd love to hear from you and hear your thoughts. So delighted today to have first Dr. Martha Jones. Dr. Jones is the Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor and Professor of History at the Johns Hopkins University. She's a legal and cultural historian whose work examines how Black Americans have shaped the story of American democracy. Dr. Jones is the author of the forthcoming book, How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All. This fall, I think, and you can tell us more about when it's coming out. Professor Jones is also a public historian, frequently writing for broader audiences at the Washington Post, USA Today, Public Books, and you might have seen her and Elaine Weiss on the recent documentary on PBS, The Vote. I was watching it and all of a sudden there they were, and I was like, oh, I know them. It was very exciting. And then of course, Elaine Weiss, so delighted to have you as well. Elaine is an award-winning journalist and writer. Her magazine feature writing has been recognized with prizes from the Society of Professional Journalists, and her byline has appeared in The Atlantic, Harper's, New York Times, Philadelphia Inquirer, as well as reports and documentaries for NPR and The Voice of America. Her long-form writing garnered a Pushcart Prize Editor's Choice Award, and she is a proud MacDowell Colony Fellow. Her first book was Fruits of Victory, The Woman's Land Army in the Great War. And the book that she is here to talk about today is The Woman's Hour, The Great Fight to Win the Vote, which I gave to my mother-in-law for her birthday earlier this year and read myself. So I'd love to start with just a few framing comments, and then am excited to turn it over to both of you because you are who everybody is here to hear from today. So, but just to start, I think, what we have to say when we commemorate, and what we do say when we commemorate and discuss the 19th Amendment is that it's really something that should have existed all along. It shouldn't have taken so long to get there, just like the 15th Amendment. These were like major exclusions by the founding fathers, and it took almost 100 years and a war for the 15th Amendment, and another 70 years for the 19th Amendment, just to establish this basic principle of enfranchisement on paper, right? And so one thing that I'm constantly amazed about is just how close the 19th Amendment came to not happening. And you detail that very well in your book, Elaine, that Tennessee almost didn't ratify it, one vote. And, I think now we all take for granted that it did happen, but it very well might not have. But of course, on paper, a right on paper is very different than an actual right that is enforced. And the 19th Amendment did nothing, or very little, I should say, to ensure that women of color could vote. And many white suffragists, as you talk about in your book and elsewhere, were certainly not there before, during, or after passage of the 19th Amendment to push for actual voting rights for Black women. Of course, that took a lot longer to secure through the Voting Rights Act in 1965. And so, I'm going to stop, but I think this is such a complex issue. And what we learn in grade school is such a tiny, tiny piece of it. And so it's been wonderful to see both of you out speaking, you know, whether it's on the PBS documentary or doing book tours, and this new book that you have, Dr. Jones, coming out, about how complex this movement was. And so really delighted to turn it over to both of you to start explaining to us, you know, introduce your books and, you know, what your books are about and how and why you chose to discuss the aspect of suffrage that you talk about. So Dr. Jones, delighted to turn it over to you to start with, and thank you so much for being here this afternoon with us.
Thank you, Brooke. I'm really happy to be here and very honored to be here with Elaine Weiss, from whom I learn something every time I have a chance to hear her. So thank you so much, Elaine, for sharing this with me. Brooke has mentioned my new book, Vanguard, How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All. And I'll say just a little bit about why I wrote Vanguard. I think first and foremost, I wanted to be sure that with this anniversary and in this election year, that we all had a stronger sense of where and out of what political tradition the African American women leaders, candidates, voters even, I wanted us to better understand Black women's political traditions. It's not a story that is captured in one that goes from Seneca Falls in 1848 to 1920, perhaps most importantly, because the story of African American women in the vote necessarily continues after 1920 through a very challenging, hard-won fight that culminates in 1965 with finally the adoption of the Voting Rights Act during the Lyndon Johnson years. So I wanted us to have some context. I don't know if there are some among you who watched Senator Kamala Harris give her acceptance speech when she was nominated last week, but politics aside, she gave us a history lesson and told us about women like Mary Church Terrell and Ida B. Wells, Shirley Chisholm. Who else did she talk about? Constance Baker Motley and more. And these are the women, coincidentally, I must say, I didn't plant the seed. I didn't have to, because Kamala Harris certainly knows her own political tradition. And Vanguard really is a book that weaves together the stories of these women across many generations. I wanted to be sure that African American women's history was well represented. I'm an academic historian, and that means I'm part of a community where we've been writing about African American women in the vote for 3 generations, frankly. But it's true that academic history doesn't always make its way into more general conversation. And so I'm super honored to be here because you all are the sort of audience precisely that I had in mind when I was writing Vanguard. You know, smart, thoughtful, engaged people with a stake in the past of our democracy and its future. So I think the thing to say is that, you know, and one of the things that I learned in writing Vanguard was that it turns out that Black women build a political movement of their own over the course of 200 years. It sometimes intersects with the stories that are more familiar to us. But for example, we know there are no African American women at the Seneca Falls meeting in 1848. Black women are elsewhere. And I write about the convention that they attend in Philadelphia in that year and how they also are demanding rights, but in a different kind of forum and in a different kind of context than their white counterparts. And so this is a lesson for me in the necessity to fully understand Black women's politics. We have to follow Black women to where they were. And they were active in churches, they were active in anti-slavery societies, in civil rights organizations, in what was in the 19th century called the Colored Convention movement, in sororities, in clubs, in teachers associations and more. Black women's stories are not encapsulated in a conventional history of suffrage associations. There are too few of them there. But when we discover them, we find that Black American women are as committed and concerned and engaged with the question of their status and their political status and their political rights, including the vote, We see the way in which they build through their own networks to support important moments like the 19th Amendment, but we also learn the ways in which anti-Black racism informs, infuses, and I think tragically shapes the movement for women's suffrage, such that Black American women are not all, but too many of them, particularly in the American South, do not benefit from the terms of the 19th Amendment. Nothing in the terms of the 19th Amendment, which, as you all certainly know, prohibits the states from using sex as an arbiter of voting rights, but guarantees to no woman the right to vote, including African American women. And so Black American women face poll taxes, literacy tests, and more. They face violence and intimidation. This is precisely, if you will, the condition of their husbands and their fathers, their brothers and their sons in 1920. And now too many Black women are also disenfranchised like Black men. And it brings us to a new chapter in the story of women's voting rights, and that is the road to the 1965 Voting Rights Act, waged in courtrooms by the NAACP, waged on the ground by African American women in their political organizations, and in some cases, Black women do a kind of end run around the problem of disfranchisement. They learn what lobbying means, how patronage works, what a federal appointment is, and that it turns out not everyone in Washington with power has gotten there by casting a ballot or running on a ticket. And so Black women stitch together political power unevenly and with great difficulty. But when we look to understand a figure like Senator Harris, we can appreciate that when she says she stands on the shoulders of women who have come before her, it is this important, powerful, but in many ways very different story of African American women in the vote that brings her to this remarkable year of 2020.
Thank you for that. Yeah, no, I mean, it's, I'm very excited to read your book because I feel like, you know, Elaine, your book was so powerful and important in capturing this, you know, one chapter of a large movement, and to really understanding and digging in deeply about what happened in those final, I guess the final year, final months in Tennessee. And, you know, I'd love you to talk a little bit about how you approached this and, you know, what you learned when you were doing your research and writing. It's a fascinating story. And I think you do a good job also at the end, and please feel free to talk about this. You do discuss what, you know, how these white women who have just won this excellent, you know, this victory that they fought hard, they then sort of, they abandon their Black sisters. And you know, so I could sort of internally was screaming like, no, like, but so I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about how you decided to, pick this part of the movement and what you discovered. Thanks.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me, Brooke. And it's really an honor. And being on the same podium or same Zoom screen with Martha has been a great pleasure for the last year or so. And I've pre-ordered her book, comes out September 8th, in case she's too shy to say that. I'm certainly looking forward. I think it's going to be a very important book for all of us to read. I came to the story of suffrage. I am not a scholar. And I have not spent my career studying this. And I had written a book about women in World War I, and how they had to battle through the government complacency and neglect and battle for the right to serve their nation in a grassroots, women-led, women-financed organization called the Women's Land Army. And in that organization were many, many suffragists. So I had an idea of what suffragists were doing in that early 20th century World War I period. I was also thinking about the fact that I'm a politically aware and active woman. My parents taught me to vote. took me into I dedicate the book to them because they took me into the voting booth when I was a little girl. I've taught my children to vote. They are very dedicated voters, and not just in presidential elections. Taught them how important it is all the way down the ballot and in every election. But I realized I didn't know how American women got the vote. I really had no idea. And, I studied history. I studied political history. I had no idea. And I was kind of shocked and ashamed by this. And then I asked some of my friends here in Baltimore, and they didn't know either. And I thought, wow, there is a gap here. And as Martha says, there's been wonderful scholarship about this for 100 years. And yet it has not, except for some really seminal books, it has not filtered down into the public consciousness. And so what I wanted to do is explore, how was it that American women got the vote? What did they have to go through to get it? It was clearly not in the original Constitution. And so I began to explore. I was kind of mucking around in the Library of Congress. I was following the money of a bequest that had been given to the suffrage movement in 1914. And I came upon the story of the ratification. And I don't think very much about ratification. You think, oh, it passes Congress, this amendment, it must, it's going to happen. If we think about the process at all. And I realized that this discussion of how this money had been spent included ratification. And then it told the story of what happened for the last ratification needed, the 36th state. There were 48 states in the Union then. And I was just riveted because it's a very dramatic story. And so I realized if I told this story, really focused on what happened in Nashville in the summer of 1920, I could pull the lens back and I could tell the whole story, or a good panorama of the story of how the women had gotten there, what they had to go through. What I discovered in that research, and most primarily primary research with some secondary newspaper and memoirs to round it out. But I was struck by how much race informed, shaped, distorted this movement. And that was something that really struck me. Of course, I think Martha has known this for a very long time, but for me, coming to the story anew, that was something that really hit me. And the fact that there were economic forces, there were corporations battling against women's suffrage. Why was that? That there were clergy battling against women's suffrage. And, that it's Frederick Douglass, who is at Seneca Falls. There are no Black women, but there is a Black man. And the relationship of the suffragists to him and to the abolition movement, and then to the civil rights movement, which is very tortured relationship and very heartbreaking in many ways. But I found this incredibly rich story. And I wanted to tell it in a popular way. I am a popular narrative historian. I wanted to make it something that people would want to read. And of course, I was lucked out finding this story of Nashville, which you literally could not make up some of these elements. But as I delved into it, it got richer and more complicated and more difficult to put the pieces together of all these special interests and political interests and political and economic forces that are buffeting this movement, this decades-long movement. And so I really needed to put it together in a way that was readable. I had to use some processes or techniques that I'd never used before as a writer, and that's suspense, because I needed to make it, everyone kind of knows what happened, but I had to make you invest as a reader in this story and not say, get me to the end.
I had to keep reminding myself that we were going to win.
Yeah, right.
Like I'm reading it and I'm like, oh my God, what's going to
I know. I had to do that. I had to figure out how to do that. My editor helped a bit. Yeah, suspense was not in my toolkit previously. But I think what I was struck by, and I finished the manuscript for this book. I handed in the manuscript on the day before the 2016 election, Monday before the Tuesday. And you know, I push the button. It's all electronic now. I push the button. I sent it to my editor in New York, my agent in New York, and they sent back, you know, type back, great timing. Okay, we think this is going to be published in the first term of the first woman president. And my editor at the time, and I've told this story before, my editor, when, you know, like when I regained consciousness, I talked to my editor. I said, well, what do we do now? As if, you know, the story wasn't meaningful. And she said, no, you know, everything's terrible, but it's actually more meaningful now. And I didn't quite understand it at the time. I think I was just too upset, but I do understand it now. I do understand what she meant, that this story resonates in a way with us in these last few years, in a way that it might not have. Not to say the centennial isn't a good reason to revisit. And one of the things that I think is so beneficial about this idea of commemorating a centennial is that it's brought out a lot of new scholarship, a lot of new writing. There are music coming out, there's dance, there's plays, but most of all, there's digging deep to bring out more voices. And as Martha said, those chronicles of what African-American women and Latina women and Native American women were doing in the suffrage movement is not in the 6-volume history of women's suffrage. It is in church records and sorority records and club records. And those are scattered and those are harder to find. And so it's not been part of the canon, and now it will be. And I think that's, if there's one accomplishment of this centennial, it's broadening and deepening and complicating this idea. So for me, it was discovering the complexity of this story, that it's not a triumphant story in any way. There are many moral and political compromises that are made that I think you as a legislator can understand, even if we think they're, you know, do not agree with them. I think one of the real surprises for me was the role of Maryland in this saga, and it is not good.
Oh, it's so bad. Why don't you, tell the story of Maryland, tell a little bit about Maryland so people know, because I certainly didn't know how bad it was. Maybe talk a little bit about that, and then I want to turn it over for a question to Dr. Jones. So, but
Sure.
about how awful Maryland is.
Maryland is not heroic in this movement. Maryland's a southern state, and Maryland is a highly racist state. And what happens is the legislature never even, or the suffragists here, and there was a vigorous suffrage movement across the state, but they never even tried to get a referendum through, which is, a referendum was to change the state constitution, and it had to be put on the ballot, and only men could vote to decide if women could vote. So knowing that it was like dead in the water, they never even tried. So Maryland never even got to defeat a referendum. But when it came to a federal amendment that would supersede state laws, Maryland was dead set against it. And its senators vote against it in Congress repeatedly, its congressmen too. When it finally does squeak through, and we should remember that in Congress, it squeaks through with like a 2-vote margin, 1-vote margin. It's very, very close. Maryland refuses to ratify. It does not ratify the 19th Amendment. And I should tell you that Maryland does not fully ceremonially ratify the 19th Amendment until 1958. It starts the process in like 41, but somehow it gets lost, and it's not till 58 till it's all signed, sealed, delivered. 1958. And this is out of racism and the idea of states' rights. And so what we find in Nashville is not only Maryland was not satisfied just um, rejecting the amendment, it then sends out emissaries from the legislature to the other southern states to convince them, their legislative brothers, to reject the amendment in those states. And so the president of the speaker of the House, I believe, is of the Maryland House, is in Nashville in that during the deliberations, trying to convince the Tennessee legislature to also reject it. And then even after the amendment is ratified, prominent lawyers in Baltimore, including William Marbury, will fight the 19th Amendment all the way to the Supreme Court. Sorry.
Not a proud history.
No.
Not a proud history. Yes. Dr. Jones, I'm wondering, one of the things Elaine just mentioned was that so many of these records are, are with the sororities at the clubs. And I'm sure you went back and had to pull a lot of that together. I can't even imagine how painstaking that was. That's why I enjoy reading books, but I don't write them. I appreciate the amazing amount of work that you both did in pulling these histories together. There was a question in the chat to me privately. Were there any sort of stories or, that you sort of fell in love with that you read along the way that of, particular women that you hadn't known about or that you had known about, but that you learned more that you are excited, to bring to life in this new book that you would like to share?
Sure. I'll tell a somewhat personal story if that's okay, because it was for me really an aha moment in writing this book. I write at home in an office where photographs of my mother, my grandmother, my great-grandmother, my great-great-grandmother all hang on the wall. And these are really the women who I feel most accountable to when I'm working and I'm writing. But as I was finishing Vanguard, I became very self-conscious because I realized I didn't know their stories. I didn't know anything about when they had voted, how they had voted. These are women who were, some of them enslaved in their own lifetimes, others of them the descendants of slaves. So I went on a sort of detour, which your editor really hates, right? Because really you're on a deadline. But I really couldn't finish the book if I didn't take time to try and find their stories. And I fix on my grandmother. She's a young woman, not so young, she's in her late 20s in 1920, raising 2 children, lives in St. Louis, Missouri. And I'm able to learn a lot about what happens in St. Louis. I even find her mother, who is a suffragist and organizing Black women in a suffrage school, training other women how to register and vote in 1920. But my grandmother just eludes me. So I follow her to North Carolina, where she settles in 1926. And I head to the state archives, right? This is what we do, right? Is you go from place to place and source to source. So I sit down in the state archives and I think, okay, now I'm going to hit the mother lode because I'm going to find the voters' rolls and the registration records, and I'll be able to figure out whether she voted. And it turns out in the state of North Carolina, no one had preserved those records.
Oh.
They didn't exist. They just didn't exist.
Wow.
So I really thought, in a sense, that I had failed. And then I very, very luckily came across an interview she had given many years later in 1978. She lived in the city of Greensboro, which is somewhat fabled for its civil rights era history. And my grandmother and grandfather had run a Black women's college in that city called Bennett College. And so she was interviewed in the 70s by historian Bill Chafe as he was writing his history, Civilities and Civil Rights, about Greensboro. And they digitized it. There it was right online when I finally figured it out. But what I discovered is that she didn't talk much about 1920 or the 20s at all when it came to voting rights. She talked about the 1950s and the 1960s. And the students at Bennett, the young women at Bennett, had organized, knocked on doors, registered folks, gotten to the polls. And she writes about this with really moving terms and explains it was thrilling because this was this intimate connection to the very tough work of voting rights in the civil rights era. But I tell the story to say that, first of all, it meant a lot to me to be able to finally find her and place her in the history I was writing. But it was also important because it affirmed my sense that you couldn't end in 1920 if you wanted to write about African American women and voting rights. That if you wanted to capture the story of someone like my grandmother and the thousands and thousands of women like her who were on the ground in the trenches, the grassroots of the modern civil rights movement, you had to come all the way forward to 1965 in order to capture their stories. And that some of what was misleading about the earlier histories is that they were truncated and didn't stay in the game and follow Black women as they went forward. So it was a wonderful way, in a sense, to be affirmed in my instincts by her. But it really has urged me to say to everybody out there who has women elders in your family, it's a great weekend to interview them. It's a holiday weekend coming up. Interview them, write it down, preserve it, because these are the ways in which we write history today, from the experiences of, you know, all kinds of everyday Americans. My grandmother's just an example of how important it is to do that.
Yeah, that's great, and a great idea. I love that. Elaine, did you have any sort of favorite woman or story or incident that you came across? I mean, other than the, I don't know if this was your favorite, you know, the fabled, you know, mother's letter is a good one, but anything that you want to share?
Sure. There were so many. I'm trying to kind of narrow it down. Yeah, finding Harry Burns' mother's letter, which is now digitized. You can actually read it online.
Oh, cool. And I guess I'm supposing that everybody knows that, but maybe you should just very briefly.
Yeah, so Phoebe Febburn is a very well-educated woman in the small town of Nyota, Tennessee, in East Tennessee. She is Harry Burns' mother. She's the one who writes that pivotal letter to Harry at the last day of the deliberations to whether to ratify the amendment in the Tennessee legislature on August 18th. She writes a letter saying, be a good boy, and help Mrs. Catt get the ratification through. And this kind of shakes his conscience, and he changes his vote. He had voted against it. And so he makes history. Now, it's not just him, because his tie vote wouldn't have, you can appreciate that. It was the, you know, the house manager, the floor manager, who really kept everybody else in line so he could break that vote. But it's been exciting not only to find that note, which thankfully was kept in its entirety, including the envelope in which she wrote, Harry T. Byrne, Nashville, the capital, Nashville, Tennessee. And it got to him in a day. And I remember calling the state, the Capitol, the State House, and asking the historian, where would that letter have gone? How would he have gotten it? I had to trace sort of the postal route. The post office worked really well in those days. And that's another subject.
Yeah, that's a whole nother topic.
I'm the daughter of a postman, so I feel passionate about it. But discovering that, and then being able to subsequently go to East Tennessee and meet Harry's descendants has been a real thrill for me, and especially his great nephew, who's a social studies teacher, middle school social studies teacher, and came to hear me in one of my talks. And we've been, he took me on a tour of Nyota, which he has managed to make acknowledge this native son. And there's now murals there, and there's a lot of recognition of this story. And to be able to, and Martha, I think will understand this, to be able to touch your history in any way, and whether that's touching it in your family, which is really special. I was not going to have that opportunity, but to touch it in today and have that reach back is very, very, very special. And so being able to meet some of the descendants as I've toured around or in my research, it's a man named Joe Hanover in Memphis. He's a young legislator who's an immigrant. He comes with his family from Poland, and he's 5 years old. They settle in Memphis, puts himself through school, puts himself through law school, believes in the American dream. He's been nurtured on the American dream. And he is elected to the House of Representatives, and women can't vote. And he becomes a big champion of women's right to vote, only because it seems to do elsewise would violate the American dream. And his mother, he says, my mother's very smart, why can't she vote? And so you see him as this staunch advocate in the legislature over and over again. And he's, he's called a kike in the legislature. He's attacked as he walks through the halls of the hotel. The governor actually has to appoint a state trooper to guard him because there have been death threats. And so you see this young man navigating this. And then I was able to interview one of his nephews in Memphis, who told me a little bit about his memories of him. And so then I could put little bits of that into my portrait. And it makes it much richer. So that's always a thrill, and you never know if you're going to be able to do that.
Absolutely. So I'm delighted to be joined by another delegate today, Delegate Sarah Love, and she says, thank you for this conversation. Do either of you have any recommendations based on your research and what you learned through it as to how we can fight back against the voter suppression that's happening across the country today?
Well, that's an important question.
Yes.
Yes. And
I'll just start us off by saying something I may have mentioned, that the women I write about, including my great-grandmother, Fannie Williams in St. Louis, Black women run suffrage schools in the YWCA, in the church basement, in their clubs, and more, because if they were going to get to the polls, it was very much a ground game in 1920, that one had to be savvy enough to navigate the obstacles if she was going to be able to register. And while that might sound so down to earth, I don't know about you all. I have this sense that there are going to be a lot of us in November who are just plain confused about the disruption of rituals that we've perhaps long relied upon when it comes to getting to the polls, whether it's the carpool or it's the mailbox on the corner, or it's the public school or the library polling place that you've relied on for many years. It's not clear to many of us that we'll vote the way we did even back in June. And so I do think that there's some important attention to be paid to our neighbors, our faith communities, however you come together with other folks. It's a year to talk about, are you voting? How are you voting? Let's look at it together. Let's go to the League of Women Voters website and just figure it out and be ready by whatever means necessary to cast our ballots. So I think that's one piece. The other thing that I admire so much about the suffragists is that they really understood politics in all of its minutiae. And what does that mean this year? It means that, yes, we have highly placed executives who are, to some degree or another, driving policy and more in this season, but there are folks in our state of Maryland and elsewhere charged expressly with running our elections. And I think it's time to learn who those folks are, how they come to be in the offices they hold, to begin to scrutinize how they do the work they do, because I think they too are accountable, in addition to folks who are standing at podiums and on national television, are the folks who are a little bit behind the scenes, but are extraordinarily consequential in this year. And many of us don't know their names. don't know quite what they do. We don't even know if it's called a board of elections or something else. But I think this is the year to learn and to let those folks know that we're paying attention and that we expect to have our ballots. We expect to be able to cast our ballots. We expect to be safe in doing so. And that is the responsibility on the ground of voting officials. And so I commend us all to go know who those folks are and, you know, hold their feet to the fire a little bit and tell them what you expect in November.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right.
Yeah, I agree completely with Martha that we are going to have to make it known that we are watching, and whether that's at the state level of the Electoral Commission, the Election Commission, city here in Baltimore City, there are known problems, and we should be vigilant that they're being fixed. Those ballots, the ballots should be mailed, and not just the application for the ballots to be mailed. One of the things that I've done is to make, it became clear to me that the book I was writing was not just kind of interesting history. I hope it is interesting history, but it had so many ramifications for today. And one of them is voting rights. And this is a history of a moment. You know, it was not the end of voting rights by any, the fight for voting rights. It was one way station. And today, that's our responsibility. And so what I've been doing is I used to be touring around the country. Now I'm zooming around the country, but I'm also trying to make it clear. And whether this is in Tennessee, which I have to tell you has some of the worst voter suppression laws in the nation now. And I have actually stood up at the Tennessee Bar Association, at the Nashville Rotary, at the Tennessee, you know, whatever powers that be I can have in my audience, and say to them, and I've said this in Missouri and in Kansas, you cannot celebrate this. You can't pat yourself on the back and say, wow, we helped get women the right to vote 100 years ago, and be slashing voting rights in those same state houses today. And, you know, Maryland, I've always been proud to say, well, we've really changed for the better in that 100 years, but it's not perfect here either. And we don't have the kind of restrictive, horrible laws that are being enacted in other states. But we have to be vigilant because there are barriers being put up. And so for me, preaching the gospel of voting rights and not only the idea that those restrictions should not exist. They should not be allowed to exist. And we elect the legislators who are making those decisions. And so, yes, we do. And we have to make it clear as citizens that we're not going to stand for that. But then there's the other flip of the coin, which is the responsibility to vote. And so I've been working with Baltimore Votes and with other grassroots organizations trying to stimulate participation, because there's a cynicism, there's a defeatism, there's a I'm too busy or my vote doesn't count. And we can't let that take root either, especially on college campuses. Now, college campuses are in a different universe this year, but participation by young people, fostering that is really, really crucial.
Yep.
I see that as a future.
Yeah, that's a great point, I think, about the cynicism, because somebody else asked about, you know, what can we do to get more people to vote, and, you know, voting holidays. And I think the truth is that it is hard. It can be hard to vote. You know, it's, I think in Maryland, we've tried to make it easier, but right, we see in the states where they mail ballots to people and they have time to just mail them back, their turnout is always the highest. But I think that you see sometimes an active, an active campaign by some politicians and the Republican Party to express that, oh, it doesn't matter, or, oh, there's voter fraud. And that in and of itself is sometimes a voter suppression tactic, right? And so it's important to recognize that. there are a couple other questions. One that was sent to me privately was about the intersection of the Voting Rights Act with the 19th Amendment. And that the Voting Rights, and a question about how the Voting Rights Act plays off of and enforces the role, the rights guaranteed in the 19th Amendment. And I don't know, Dr. Jones, if you want to talk a little bit about, what one has to do with the others and what you discovered in your research.
Sure. So the preamble to the Voting Rights Act of 1965 rests Congress's authority firmly in the 15th Amendment. So to wind back just a little bit to the years after the Civil War, in 1870, a 15th Amendment to the Constitution is ratified. Its language is the template for the 19th Amendment, but it prohibits the federal government and the states from using race as a criteria when determining voting rights. The story of that amendment, of course, and the necessity for the 15th Amendment, the Voting Rights Act, is precisely the ways in which, despite that amendment, states are able to use poll taxes and literacy tests and more to keep African American men from the polls. Enter African American women most forthrightly in 1920, though there are certainly Black women who are voting even before 1920 in important states like California, New York, Illinois. I would say, to my read, a Voting Rights Act that rests in the 15th Amendment and not the 19th Amendment was written by folks who weren't thoroughly thinking about the intersectional questions and the distinct political position of African American women. Now, we know in practice the Voting Rights Act has been used, if you will, equally to address the voting rights interests of Black women along with African American men, but it doesn't speak yet. We don't yet in 1965, I think, have a thoroughgoing enough analysis of the ways in which racism and sexism intersect and especially impact the lives of Black women. 1965, we haven't yet met Shirley Chisholm. She's just entering politics in New York State in that year. So in a way, it's the Voting Rights Act that gives African American women a new kind of access, a new kind of platform, and immediately women like Chisholm, Barbara Jordan, and others, as they assume the podium, as they take the national stage, begin to speak about the ways in which Black women face a distinct set of impediments, that some of which are legal, others which are cultural and political. But these are the women who Kamala Harris importantly invokes precisely because they provide an analytic framework for thinking about what voting rights can and should mean. But the Voting Rights Act, while there are certainly women who are integral to getting the Voting Rights Act passed and signed, it is not one that wholly recognizes the distinct position of Black women in the body politic.
That is really interesting. Thank you for sharing that. I had no idea. So we're going to close soon, and I want you each to be able to make final remarks. But one other question that was sent in that I think is interesting before we get to that has to do with the ERA. There was another mini series this summer that came out that I honestly was hard to watch because, watching and reading books about this, I know it turns out well. So when there's suspense or I'm anxious, I rest easy, but that is not the case with the ERA. And I'm curious if either the question is sort of like, what do we do to get the ERA going again? Of course, Virginia finally just ratified it actually, but I'm curious if either of you, in your research, confronted the ERA or it came up at all, or if you have thoughts on it.
Yeah, I certainly did, because what happens after ratification of the 19th Amendment in August 1920 is the suffrage movement pretty much disperses. And at least the white women's suffrage movement, the major, the National American Association. And women go off to their political parties, to their own interests. The wing of the suffrage party that remains, that stays intact, is the National Women's Party, Alice Paul's party. And her idea was always broader than just suffrage. It was truly women's rights. And so she says in 1920, I mean, just weeks later, actually, she says it on the day, I think I quote her in the book, saying on the day of ratification, okay, this is great, we got the vote, now we have to go on to the next phase of leveling the playing field and dismantling the barriers that women have in other aspects of their lives, like economic, educational, a whole range. And so she immediately begins working on what she expects will be the 20th Amendment. Yeah, and she goes to law school, she gets a law degree, and she and several of her lieutenants draft this Equal Rights Amendment. It is introduced into Congress in 1923. It has been 97 years. And when I write about how the suffragists were fearful that if they failed in Tennessee, they might not actually get a chance to, the momentum would not be with them. They didn't know what the fate of the ERA would be, but it certainly teaches us that an amendment can get so close. We know it sat in Congress for almost 50 years and then comes out in the 1970s, has a deadline imposed. Whether that's legal or not is going to be adjudicated. But I do want to say that while we look at the Equal Rights Amendment today as a sort of litmus test of feminist qualifications and all that, it was controversial from the beginning. Many of former suffragists did not support it. Carrie Chapman Catt did not support it. Women in the labor movement did not support it. Eleanor Roosevelt never supported it because they feared it might jeopardize some of the protective legislation that had been so painstakingly achieved through the progressive era, protecting women in industry, for instance. So it was controversial. It was not like a done deal. Of course, women are going to, way before Phyllis Schlafly. Phyllis Schlafly brings a whole other level to it. But I'd actually like to ask Martha, how did African-American women have any opinion on this? Did it mean anything to them?
Well, what it meant to Black women was that they were going to have to go it alone when it came to pursuing federal legislation that would override and undo the Jim Crow laws that are going to keep them from the polls.
Right.
And you know that Hallie Quinn Brown, who is the president of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs in 1920, Hallie Quinn Brown will go to Alice Paul and appeal to her in 1921, appeal to Alice Paul, asking her to stay in the fight for women's votes, use her influence to now win legislation, federal legislation that would give teeth to the 19th Amendment. And Paul declines and moves on to the Equal Rights Amendment. And so that is a tough moment for African-American women who perhaps somewhat without a great deal of optimism, still are going to give Alice Paul the opportunity to link arms with them and continue in the struggle for women's votes after 1920.
Right.
And then a terrible sort of forecast of what will come. Doesn't Alice Paul, correct me if I'm wrong, Martha, say that's a racial issue. It is not a women's issue.
That's awful. Well, I want to just give you each a couple minutes to make some final comments for everybody who's listening on, I'm thrilled to have you both on, really excited to read Vanguard. And I've put the link to, I'm a big fan of Bookshop. It supports their local bookstores, so bookshop.org rather than Amazon. And would love to have you just say a few final parting words for what we should be thinking about in this 100-year centennial as we think about the complexities of the suffrage movement. So maybe we'll go in reverse order, and Elaine, will start to you and then finish with Dr. Jones.
Well, thank you. And it's been a great pleasure. And of course, Brooke, you represent the dream of the suffragists. You are a woman in an elected office. Represent your district with distinction, and you are, poised for a great career. And I hope we'll all be supporting you for many years to come. But you do represent the dream of the suffragists. And I think 100 years on, I think they'd be disappointed that there are only, in our state legislatures, only about 24% of female delegates and representatives. In Congress, about 25%, and that's the high mark that we've ever had. Hope we'll push forward and have even more this year in the election. But I think that it is time for us to have a reckoning, not just about race, but about democracy, about what kind of nation are we if we're still making it hard for our citizens to vote. And that we should not be complacent or accept the kind of restrictions that are being put on citizens of other states. Luckily in Maryland, not too much here, but other states, we've seen the line, and there are insidious ways to restrict the vote. It's not always by law. It could be putting one polling place in a large community, making it, hours to wait. There are lots of ways to make it harder. And I think we should have a reckoning, a real out and out conversation about how can we call ourselves a democracy if we're going to do this. I just saw that the Jimmy Carter Center is actually going to be monitoring the US elections for fraud and for restrictions, which is usually done in not mature democracies. And I think that should be an embarrassment to us. So for me, my mission is to take this history forward and say, this is why you vote, because of what these women did, the white women and the Black women. This is what they fought for. And you have the responsibility to vote. So as a member of the League of Women Voters of Baltimore City, I urge everyone here, and I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir in this particular seminar, but it's really essential, and this year more than ever, to talk to your friends, talk to your family, talk to your children, and make sure they're out there and voting.
Well, that's a perfect opening for what I wanted to say is it's a year to really speak and to bring young people into the process like never before. They're getting very mixed messages, I think, from officialdom about what a democracy is, how it works, and the place of voting in a democracy. Many of us remember, elders taking us along, standing in the booth, gazing up at the elbow while they fiddle with the levers. But these were moments of civic education. So however you vote this year, be safe, but take a young person with you to the polls, to the post box at the kitchen table while you fill out that paper ballot. I just don't think we can rely upon officialdom, frankly, to do that work of fundamental civic education, and talk to young people about what it means and how hard it was in the story that Elaine Weiss tells, in the story that I tell, how women before us gave up a great deal in order that we can vote. That might be cliched in some circles, but I think it's a lesson that has to be taught in every generation.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you so much to both of you for all your work in illuminating and bringing to life these incredibly important stories. I think, especially this year, it presents a very important opportunity for all of us to know this history, to resurface it, and to understand why it's so relevant and important still today as we continue to fight for voting rights and voting access. So Thank you so much to everybody. Be safe, be well, stay healthy, and keep in touch. Take care, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Brooke.
Thank you, Brooke.
Thank you.